My name is David Leopold, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this year's John Milton Lecture, the seventh in what we hope is slowly becoming a well-established and successful tradition. My day job involves teaching political theory in the politics department of the university, but I'm also a tutor here, and my college fellowship, like this lecture, is named after John Milton. I'm really pleased to have that association. Not least of all, Milton has lots of positive connotations for political theorists. He's thought of as a fierce defender of Republican freedom and of a free press. But there is also an element of something like relief here because of the alternative possibilities in the modern and not so modern university. I recently noticed that my political theory counterpart in what I'll say is another college is officially the Robert Maxwell Fellow in politics. For those under 40, Robert Maxwell's life included his stealing hundreds of millions of pounds from the Mirror Group pension fund. Milton's links with Mansfield are perhaps a little bit tenuous, I think we should admit that. But they are, in a way, very material. He was an inspirational figure to the nonconformists who established the college in the late 19th century. They viewed him as a kind of fellow traveller who lent intellectual and spiritual authority to their educational efforts. And they built Milton into the very fabric of the college. It's his statue that you can see but not quite identify at the top of the tower, above the main door of the original buildings. And he also appears nearer full size and much more visible in the stained glass of the chapel, in the second window on the west-facing window where he stands just underneath Oliver Cromwell. This annual lecture and my college fellowship are named after Milton at the request of Charles and Caroline Brock. They both worked at Mansfield for some 35 years before returning to their home in Pennsylvania in the United States. And I think it's very typical of them that when they became generous benefactors to Mansfield, they didn't want their own name given prominence, but that of one of their heroes. Caroline sadly died in 2017, and Charles isn't able to be with us this year, partly because of his own health issues. But in their time at Mansfield, they made a huge contribution to college life. Senior members of Oxford colleges are not always well known to, say, non-academic staff or to students outside of their own specialisms, but Caroline and Charles were well known to absolutely everybody. Caroline respected above all for her contribution to the musical life of the college, and Charles perhaps for his kind of practical demonstration in his own life of his conviction that having fun and engaging in learning were not mutually exclusive. They both played a vital part, I think, in Mansfield actually becoming the kind of friendly and open community that Oxford colleges always say they are, but don't always succeed in being. I'll now invite the Principal, Helen Mountfield, to introduce today's speaker and respondent, but not before adding that when Charles learnt about today's participant, he wrote to me saying, and I won't attempt the accent, saying, "What a lineup, couldn't be better."
Thank you, David, and I'm glad to see so many people here. Oh, I have about 100 microphones. There we are. I'm glad to have so many people here for one of our Friday lectures, illustrating, I hope, that learning and having fun are not mutually exclusive things, certainly not at Mansfield. We're very pleased to have this Friday's lecture as our annual Milton Lecture, my first annual Milton Lecture. So I was asking my colleagues who would be a good lecturer. They came up with Margaret Kean, who's the Dame Helen Gardner Fellow of English at St Hilda's College. Just told me she was a junior research fellow here, so I'm sorry that I missed that, but very enthusiastic reception for what a fantastic talk she would give us, which I'm sure you will. And seems very appropriate as well for a college where we are interested in politics and literature and human rights and philosophy, and really thinking about how the world works. And this evening's lecture, Taking Liberties, Contemporary Fiction and the Fall of Man, is going to be quite a lot about Margaret's work on children's literature that deals especially with this subject, and particularly the work of Philip Pullman. And we're very pleased that Philip is here and will be able to offer his thoughts on Margaret's thoughts about his work. So Margaret's going to speak for a bit, then Philip will make some observations, and then I will take some questions from the floor as I usually do. So thank you very much, Margaret.
Thank you for that introduction, Principal, and thank you so much for inviting me to be here this evening. It is an absolute thrill to be back at Mansfield, where I had my first ever job, and an absolute thrill to be back to give the John Milton Fellows Lecture. It was quite remarkable, as somebody who was working on Milton and finishing my doctorate at the time, to be walking under the statue of the young Milton and to be thinking, haha, he's not the Lady of Christ, he's the lad of Mansfield. And to be part of this community which does put free thinking first, and to start to think about how that might both be challenging for an early modernist who's thinking about historical context, and Charles Brock's take, which was quite embracing of all angles, could be challenging for someone who was still trying to pass a degree. But at the same point in time, to know that learning and fun and a little bit of rigour were all things that you would find in this institution has stood me in good stead. So it's lovely to be back, and it's lovely to be talking about liberty. And taking liberties did seem right for the named lecture and for Charles, and for thinking also about the ways in which we use our past and the ways in which we use those who came before us in the struggle, the ways in which sometimes we have to deny them quite the complications of their own contexts and structures in order to fight to have the space to develop our own voice or to develop our own opportunities, that sometimes we actually restrict the arguments that we can find in past authors and past voices and past philosophers and past interactions in order to be able to promote the moment. So a bit of a question about the impossibility of not living in our own context, political and individual, but also a little bit of a challenge to how presentism might work, or how the kind of the constant positioning of our own moment as superior to others might be functioning. And that is something that I think we can find happening, particularly perhaps as a kind of a debate and as a difficulty in the texts that we give younger people and the ways in which we expect them to respond to those texts. And I chose those words carefully, the ways in which we might expect them to respond, and whether we are expecting them to respond with challenge, whether we are actually opening up the ways in which that challenge might be mounted, or whether we are in fact shaping to some extent the ways in which we expect them to frame their argument. And the ways in which great authors, and I would actually include Sir Philip amongst those, I think he is part now of our classics, and as such is somebody who we can take liberties with, one of our forefathers. And that's partly what I want to talk a little bit about tonight. So the John Milton Lecture, Taking Liberties, Contemporary Fiction and the Fall of Man, but you see that immediately what I've done is move us from Genesis through this John Milton concept to a picture which is Blake. So I want to be talking about the ways in which we challenge and the ways in which we refute and the ways in which we renew argument and the ways in which we use past authors to do that. Milton for Blake, very, very famously of the Devil's Party without knowing it. So an individual who, as David has told us, can be positioned with a radical revolutionary force, and Philip's work would obviously offer us that, but also someone who is still contemplating and considering the structures of the Christian inheritance and the structures specifically of Genesis. So what I wanted to talk about tonight more specifically are two novels. I chose two novels simply to make it comparative, and also because I think they do tell us something about our current moment. Both of these novels are prize winners. They've both won the Costa Prize. It was the Whitbread when the Amber Spyglass won in 2001. It's the Costa when Frances Hardinge wins for the Lie Tree in 2015. And these are, so far, the only two quote-unquote children's literature texts to win the overall Book of the Year prize. So I think that might help us work out something about the way in which our current moment promotes its own arguments and suggests ways in which we might take those arguments forward. And I think there's actually quite a lot that these novels have in common. In fact, I'm kind of coming to the conclusion as I'm sort of thinking this through that Frances Hardinge must have been in the quite frustrating position of having ideas that she wanted to further, ideas about liberty, ideas about evolution, ideas about young female protagonists, and she had to deal with the fact that somebody had got there not so very long before and had written quite a major novel with some of those same themes. So, a 14-year-old girl in the Lie Tree, Faith Sunderley, a 14 or so year old girl in Lyra Belacqua, both of them extremely good liars. And that's one of the key kind of points for a kind of an argument where you're going to think about truth, or where you're going to think about ways in which something could be given a particular value. Both of them testing the limitations of an established and inherited world order. Both of them doing so in texts which we might say have located themselves at the crisis of faith, have located themselves in some way in a kind of Victoriana type context, slightly fictionalized, but kind of Victoriana nonetheless. Late 1860s for the Lie Tree, and I guess semi-Edwardian, semi-late Victorian, if we're thinking about Lyra's world from Northern Lights through, although time was obviously quite flexible in the multiverse that Philip Pullman has given us. But Victorian kinds of restrictions in both in terms of gender and sexuality, and both authors actually quite specifically using the word curiosity. Both authors quite specifically offering and suggesting and modelling ways in which we should be curious about the natural world, in which we should observe in order to come to conclusions, or in order to come to ways of thinking further. Both of them also, actually, as it turns out, really quite interested in technologies, particularly the technology of the camera. And the kind of shadow in the plate is actually something that turns into haunting in texts that kind of we find in the Hardinge text. But I think my key point would actually be that both of them choose as their theme something to do with change, and they link that change up to evolution. So both of them, thinking about the crisis of faith, are kind of going to position it in the tension between the inherited religious concept and the inherited religious structure and the new thinking of science. And what I want to do is show how that functions, show how that could initially be considered very much in a sort of an easy fashion as kind of the blame game, where we put kind of the blame on the father figure, or we put the blame on the creator, or we put the blame on the past format that has caused us to have a limited viewpoint or a limited understanding of life, and lost our freedom or lost our liberty. And then we make the argument that transgression gives us the liberty back, that transgression is the only way that we can claim back our opportunity to make free choice. Lots and lots of arguments there, not for a Friday night, about determination and free will, but I kind of want to work with this idea of moving forward and how we do it, and particularly about how we talk about endings as beginnings. So Philip Pullman is obviously going to offer us a trilogy and then take us in the Amber Spyglass to a final chapter called The Botanic Garden. The Lie Tree is going to take us to a final chapter called Evolution. And here's someone else, Mr. Milton. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest, and Providence their guide. They hand in hand, with wandering steps and slow, through Eden took their solitary way. So the idea in the very last lines of Paradise Lost of stepping out, and what we're stepping out into is history. What we're stepping out from is the pastoral space, that was outside of time. We've fallen into temporality, and we're moving out to actually the future that is the past that we know. So we're moving out into that which has been written, into that which can be found in the Old Testament, also into that which has been written in the Book of Nature. So this step out that you can find also, in so many ways in the visual tradition for illustrating Genesis, the step out of Eden, is it a problem, is it a negative, or is it an opportunity? And that idea of kind of stepping out is something where you're stepping out into history and being able to tell the story anew and perhaps reclaim a certain level of autonomy is one of the debates I think that we find in the ways in which authors of the 21st century are returning us to these points and to these places. Both novels are actually offering us retellings of Genesis. The Library has within it a kind of fictional fairy tale story about a tree that you eat the fruit, and it has this particular effect on you. But the question is whether this tree, this lie tree, this mendacity tree, is in fact the tree of knowledge. Whether it in fact takes us back to Genesis, and that's part of the playful plot lines that Frances Hardinge is offering us. Philip obviously has offered us a very balanced and multi-purposed set of retellings of Genesis, and I kind of want to work through some of the ways in which we encounter those in a linear fashion, so the reader is encountering them one after the other. But he's offering us a multiple set of versions for the etiological creation myth, for the study of causes. So by offering you more than one way in which you can think about the study of causes, he's opening up the whole idea of methodology. But we're thinking about disobedience, we're thinking about free will, we're thinking about what the role of the creator might be, and we're thinking about questions of lying and questions of tempting. And I guess the first one that we might look at is towards the end of Northern Lights, where Lyra, our kind of curious and outspoken young protagonist, having already encountered a restrictive moral code, having already encountered the powers of the church in society in an adverse fashion, is beginning to become a free thinker. And she's offered a big black book by her father to look at, and that's the book of Scripture. And she's pretty much going to reject it. But this is one of the things that's important in the little discussion that they have. As she's rejecting that, we're aware that actually one of the plot lines within Pullman's wider storyline is that in rejecting the old story of Adam and Eve, we're making space, we're taking liberty to tell a completely new version of Eve. Not a retelling of the old story, but something that has not yet been done. And that is actually quite exciting, the idea of whether you can construct something that has not yet been thought of, or whether you would have to place it with some set of preconditionings. And we get this particular, let's go with that. Okay. We get this particular line. This is, Lord Asriel is Lyra's father, and it's offering us a moment when they're talking through the story of Genesis as they've encountered it and read it in Lyra's world. So it actually is already not quite the story as we know it, because of clearly the story of creation and the story of the fall in Lyra's world involves demons. But we get these lines. Lord Asriel said, "Church scholars have always puzzled over the translation of that verse. Some say it should read not, unto dust shalt thou return, but thou shalt be subject to dust. And others say that the whole verse is a kind of pun on the words ground and dust. And it really means God's admitting his own nature to be partly sinful. No one agrees, no one can, because the text is corrupt. But it was too good. Sorry, this isn't really doing what it's supposed to do. At least I'm not doing it right if it is. But it was too good a word to waste. Doesn't want to do it. It was too good a word to waste, and that's why the particles became known as dust. What I wanted to point out here is the way in which it's the terminology of dust that's significant and important in the that's significant and important in the construction here. That we are taking a very important word from the scripture and a very important word from our understanding of a whole kind of cyclical formation of Adam through to mortality, and the fall as being a fall into mortality. And what we're picking up from it is a word dust. And of course we have an author who is going to reproduce or renew our understanding of that term in some highly significant ways. He's going to challenge the essentialist imposition of meaning that we might be used to with a regulation of commandments and take us forward into a new form. And in so doing, I think we might remember that he's interested in Blake. And I just wanted to show you this picture and kind of talk a little bit about the ways in which this might offer us some understanding of the structure of thought which is seen of as imposing regulation and fundamentalist, kind of essentialist interpretation upon social existence and social interaction. So this is the Garden of Love from the Songs of Experience. I went to the Garden of Love and saw what I never had seen. A chapel was built in the midst where I used to play on the green, and the gates of this chapel were shut, and thou shalt not, writ over the door. So I turned to the Garden of Love that so many sweet flowers bore, and I saw it was filled with graves and tombstones where flowers should be, and priests in black gowns were walking their rounds and binding with bars my joys and desires. So kneeling down, bowed heads, the tonsure, the gravestones, the book, the indicator from the monk downwards to the grave, something that's lineal, something that's restrictive, something that's a reductive doctrine. This all helps us understand that terminology of dust in a negative formation that is being picked up upon in the text that we just saw from Northern Lights. The commandment in the negative, the restraining of desire, and those last two lines, which, although they expand to the kind of four iambic feet, are still shackled by the internal line. Priests in black gowns are walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires. And those lines in particular, and that attitude, that argument, would take us immediately to the gobblers from the story in Dark Materials. I think even more obviously it takes us to Amber Spyglass and to Father Gomez, the priest who arrives in Mulefa land. Not only is he there to stop Lyra, but one of his first thoughts is of conversion, and what he wishes to do is to take the flying birds and stop them flying. So that whole idea of that as being what we see in this picture, what we see in Blake, and what we find in an argument that's being run in his Dark Materials. If we took it forward to La Belle Sauvage, we'd be thinking about the League of St. Alexander, and I think probably about the setting for the Mausoleum Island. It'll be interesting to see if there's more examples to add to that list as time goes on. But within the Blakean kind of tradition and the way in which I think Philip Pullman is so interested in using it, you put the Garden of Love usually alongside another kind of little cluster of poems. So it goes with London, the poem that most of us know, I wandered through each charted street. It goes with The Human Aspect, which is a poem which actually constructs a tree within the language of the poetry with its roots and its branches, and that's the branches of mystery, a very negative formation, which again I think has echoes in some works. This bears the fruit of deceit. And in its last stanza for The Human Abstract, the gods of the earth and sea sought through nature to find this tree, but their search was all in vain. There grows one in the human brain. And it's actually more the illustration that is going to help you than any need to actually be able to read the lines per se on the screen. That idea of binding yourself, this kind of net that's over your head, which may or may not actually be your own construction, caught in your own mind-forged manacles, if we took the line from London that we're so familiar with. This is a kind of little cluster that's there in Blake, Garden of Love, London, Human Abstract, and the other one is a poison tree. I was angry with my friend. I told my wrath did end. I was angry with my foe. I told it not. My wrath did grow. And I watered it with fears, night and morning with my tears, and I sunned it with smiles and with soft, deceitful wiles, and it grew both day and night till it bore an apple bright. And my foe beheld it shine, and he knew that it was mine, and into my garden stole. When the night had veiled the pole, in the morning glad I see my foe outstretched beneath the tree. So this one's a first-person confessional rather than something more polemic like in London. It's unfolding a sense of clandestine hostility, of a deep emotional verity that's actually anger, envy, malice. The surface hypocrisy is covering a lack of generosity, a rejection of fellow feeling, an unhealthy channel for emotion that shows up as a death wish. There's not a solution in this murder or in this death. Instead, it's an infection of thought. And I think it's very much worthwhile bearing in mind that the version in Blake's notebook calls this Christian forbearance. Deep irony. And in Harding's novel, The Lie Tree, hypocrisy and envy flourish, falsehoods spread, and sour relations. Faith's father is found dead in his study. She suspects murder, and her detective work will lead her to the discovery of a strange tree. It grows when it's fed lies, and in return, consumption of its fruit will bring some level of hidden knowledge. She then goes on to discover that there's a foe who is plotting vengeance for a previous wrong, and the vendetta is premised on past secrets and the sins of her own father. Death for more than one party is the outcome. So that bitterly ironic Christian forbearance is actually a very apt summary for what Harding is doing in at least one of the plot lines for a restrictive patriarchal atmosphere and the effect that it can have on a child in her novel. The young protagonist, Faith, will undertake scientific observation of this plant, the mendacity tree, and the effects of its fruit. She's actually going to consume it to see what it does. And it's all about false news, really. It's very, very timely. She wants to become a natural scientist. Experimenting through interaction with the tree will help her understand it better. But consumption is also contagion, and this is flagged as the plot thickens. So this is Faith. You do not know me. I am poison. Every lie on the island of Vain is my doing. And she's talking to a young man called Paul. Have you lied to me? Faith realized that she had not. She swallowed and said nothing. So one of the things that I think we're finding both of our current authors persisting with or promoting is a predisposition to good. And these stories about good against evil are these stories about the way in which one interacts. The social good is actually something that's being promoted. Whether that's something that we actually particularly want to laud in books that we consider to be for younger people, I don't quite know, but I think it's actually rather interesting that we find it in both. And what we're actually finding in Harding is that this young woman, Faith, were she to have read Blake, would be a better reader. Because she's actually allowing all of the options to be assessed. The younger generation is given the liberty to follow the first lines of the poem, to be like the way that you treat a friend. You talk to them. It's when you don't speak that you have the hostility and the hypocrisy and the foe. So this is actually Faith and Paul becoming friends at this juncture. So it is a reading of the Blake, and it's a fuller reading of the Blake, which actually understands that there were options even in that poem. By contrast, the foe in the novel, and I don't want to use a spoiler, but the foe in the novel starts to speak of my tree, and would exploit that for social gain and for financial profit. When Philip Gallagher was talking about the Blake poem, Poison Tree, it's a well-known article. He talks about this poem as being, quote, a counter-myth which exposes the biblical narrative as a fraud and gives the true etiology of the tree of knowledge. So again, this thing about causes, the true etiology of the tree of knowledge, Christian forbearance, this negative, bitter fruit. And that's not very far from other ways of thinking in the period. But this idea of the etiology, the study of causes, of the fall, of original sin, of determined thought, against epistemology, a theory of knowledge where you study the theories of how knowledge is constructed, where truth becomes a problem, where truth becomes the puzzle. Is this one of the reasons why we're so obsessed with the detective novel? But this is actually also one of the problems where we solve the case, where actually we think we can come to a conclusion. In Harding, at the juncture where this Blake poem is acknowledged, the quote that we've just seen, Faith has actually encountered Paul Klee at night time. And she's initially very distrustful of him and of the story that he's out in the night taking photographs. But she becomes convinced because he's actually embarrassed to tell her so. And the term curiosity is used at this point, and that's a pointer towards truth. What Paul says is, I was taking a picture of the moon. I heard it could be done. Pictures clear enough that you can see the shadows and the peaks. Whenever there is a full moon and a clear night, I go out and try my luck. So there's a hunger for knowledge, there's a hunger for exploration here. And this is about photography in the late 1860s. And it might well be that you would be hungry to have this particular objective, to be able to photograph the moon and see the detail. That's actually going to take a temporal exposure to manage that, and it's going to need every other way in which the conjunctions are right for the atmospherics. I think when it's a box camera, and I could be completely wrong on this because I haven't Googled it to find out, but presumably you're also viewing it upside down while you're taking this. So there is a thing about what do you see against what you're trying to do, which is actually rather close to Blake with his devil's writing and seeing things backwards. So the whole point here is that we start to be very, very interested in ways of seeing. And these are about ways of seeing rather than there being one object which will be perfect or which will be the final point of knowledge. It will be taking us towards something. The lens, presumably in the camera, is working quite a lot in the same way as the kind of aerial telescope would work. And of course, there is a very famous description of what it's like to view the moon through a telescope and see those shadows and peaks. And the telescope is a scientific instrument that's invented and refined in the early decades of the 17th century. And goodness what, Milton, in Paradise Lost, but talking about a trip that he made to Italy in 1638 or 9, although there is some debate that actually he may have seen a telescope in this country. But this is Milton talking about what it's like to look at the moon through a telescope. And he gives it to, or he puts it into a description where he's talking about Satan raising himself from the fiery lake of hell and putting his shield on his back, and his shield is like the moon. Behind him cast the broad circumference, hung on his shoulders like the moon, whose orb, through optic glass, the Tuscan artist views at evening from the top of Faisalais, or in Valdarno, to descry new lands, rivers, or mountains in her spotty globe. So we're aware of the optical challenge here. You can descry new lands, you can see the rivers and the mountains, but technically you can't tell which is which, and you can't tell which is which even in most photographs. The eye is going to perceive relief differently, and according to the orientation and the illumination through the lens, those markers can be either rivers or mountains. And that's actually what Milton's getting at, that you can see it, but you're not quite sure which way round it is. So he actually says you can see it from the top of a mountain, or you can see it from a valley, and so that's Faisalais and Valdarno, and what you will see are rivers or mountains. And the same will be true for the photographic plate. The image will show indentations on the surface of the moon, but the ridges and the gullies, it won't be clear which are which. So you have here a question of knowledge, and a question of knowledge encompassing and embracing fallibility and variability and the push to discover more. In contrast to that need to keep testing is the father figure in this novel who wants certainty and proof. Erasmus Sunderley is hoping to use natural science and archaeological evidence in particular to confirm the text of Scripture as true. He desires the tree to be living proof of the Garden of Eden. And his daughter already, just on the basis of what she's seen, won't accept that. The question is whether the reader will, whether the reader who is reading a lie tree will simply accept that the game is to discover whether this links to Genesis or not. In the plot of Harding's novel, the tree is coming from China, and we're being encouraged rather to consider it as a fairy tale, or perhaps as something to do with magic realism. But were we to return to Blake and to the history of his poem, it would get more complicated. And it would look round to bring us to the natural science of Blake's day. There's an article from 2001 by Andrew Stauffer, Blake's Poison Trees, that's reminding us of the arboreal natural sciences that were known to Blake. and then adding new discoveries from the archives. One key tie between Blake and natural science is that he has an engraving included in Erasmus Darwin's long poem from the 1790s, The Botanic Garden. In that poem, Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, proposes a scientific theory of the development of the living world, and it's an extremely well-known and influential text. It includes information about the upas tree, which is a legendary poisonous tree from Java. And this essay from 2001 by Stauffer is showing direct Blake references to that natural poison tree, and also tracking the wide uptake of that sensational discovery in the poems and plays of the Romantic period by people like Coleridge and Byron. Stauffer is also identifying an alternative but contemporaneous poison tree from the Americas, which has a name that can refer to apple. So we've got this way in which natural science and the global discovery of plant hunters is feeding a publicity machine even in the 1790s, and the sensationalism of response that we want there. So when we have a magic realism novel in the second decade of the 21st century, it might be foolish of us to presume that it does no more than respond to Genesis. Blake scholars have been quick to identify the apple bright of a poison tree as an analogue to the forbidden fruit of Genesis and Paradise Lost, says Stauffer. But it seems also to owe something to the poisonous apple of natural sciences. Harding's leaving it to us to dig all of that up, if we like, and one of her other storylines is about archaeology. The father has faked a fossil. He wanted to prove existence of the Nephilim, who are in Genesis 6, the offspring of the sons of God and daughters of men. He's actually involved his innocent daughter in that fraud, letting her think that the discovery of a fossil which had a human shoulder blade with a wing attached belonged to her. So we gave the idea that you could believe in that fossil to an 11-year-old child. So the novel is not a fake fossil, it's not a lie tree, but it is fiction, and it's a recounting in the present that aims to gesture both forth and back, a history of evolution, in a story that embeds individual ethical choice and women's political liberation into that fiction. It's challenging determinism, and it's challenging restriction. Its feminist cohesion has gained it many plaudits, although it actually also has a certain way in which it's actually quite tightly restrictive and a little bit precocious. But I'd like to suggest today that that false fossil might also be a younger author or an author who is coming in the footsteps of Sir Philip. A very light reproof, a slightly competitive edge to those children's fiction writers who bring angels into their texts for younger readers. So we have David Allman's Skellig, and we have Pullman's His Dark Materials. And Harding needs to take some liberties and needs to find a space. And I rather wonder whether in all of this story of science, we actually also don't have a light gesture towards an attempt at independence. It doesn't seem to me that anyone's going to be outstretched beneath a tree in this. I think it's all between friends and there's no fear. But one of the other things that it's actually also doing is just bringing to our attention the resonance of Genesis 6. So we always think about the fall of man, but we don't always think about this very, very difficult text where evil is said to be identified by the Godhead. When the sons of men and, when the sons of God and the daughters of men hook up, when mankind is actually starting to learn about metalwork and technology, when cosmetics appear, and when this is the time when we actually need a flood to cleanse society. An argument that we find in the Book of Enoch, an area of the text which is actually also linked up with the name Baruch, whom we can find in his Dark Materials. A way in which we're talking here about texts which are canonical against texts which are apocrypha, and whether we should be reading the apocrypha and what level of truth or measurement of truth comes into play when we do. And I do believe that this is a very interesting argument for Pullman on heresy and choice and a range of variant text and multiple Genesis texts and the rest. And just recently, Geoffrey Hill, the Book of Baruch by the Gnostic Justin. There's something in the ether at this moment to take us to this place, to take us to this sense of challenge through thinking through the argument one more time. I wanted to say something about the endings of the last two novels as a kind of completion of this argument. We've said Harding has evolution, and we've said that Pullman has the Botanic Garden. These are the last lines for Harding's novel. This is the mother. "So what do you want?" asked Myrtle. "I want to help evolution. My dearest girl, I have not the faintest idea what you are talking about." Faith thought about the best way to rephrase her resolution. "I want to be a bad example," she said. "I see." Myrtle stirred herself, ready to walk to the prow. "Well, my dear, I think you have made an excellent start. It's delightful, it's witty, it's constructed, and it's tidy." We also have a movement towards the front of a boat, so we have a whole sort of way in which a journey is taking place and on its way. What Faith is not is a nun. And she's keeping well away from any garden at the end of that novel. Cloistered virtues, not greatly in favour, either by Harding or by Pullman or by Milton, from whom the phrase comes, or by Blake. This is Convent Thoughts, painted in Oxford in about 1850, which is, not a bad date against the evolution argument, slightly early. But it's Charles Collins, and it's in the Ashmolean. The woman in the garden here, very much symbolic of pre-Raphaelite thought, contemplation, retreat, chastity as the themes that we're seeing. A hortus concludes us, the idea of the garden that's walled. She's reading in a religious book, the Book of Hours. She's holding a passion flower. There's a lily, very prominent. This was almost immediately ridiculed in Punch. You don't need to wait to 2015 for this. And in 1852, in David Masson's review, little girls keeping their chrism pure against blue backgrounds, other little girls kneeling in church doorsteps to say their prayers. Puseyite clergymen may like such artistic helps towards teaching young ladies the way to a blessed life, but most decidedly the public is right in declaring that though the painting were never so good, the public will not stand for that sort of thing. So what on earth, given that we know all of that, is Pullman doing, taking us to a garden at the end of Amber Spyglass? To which the answer is probably whatever he likes, and I'm about to say something completely spurious and wrong. But I'm fascinated. I'm fascinated that we go there. I'm fascinated that this concept and this conceit of the girl in the garden is at the end of this storyline, the completion of the prophecy of Lyra as New Eve. It's an idea also of Nostos, of Lyra, who was our kind of Odyssean voice coming home, and this is where she's coming home to. She's coming home to be at one with herself, that's very clear. But why the garden, why the pastoral, why the pause? Is it stasis? Are we worried about it being stasis? Why aren't we at that prow going forward? Why are we leaving things in a space which is less conclusive or more of a hortus conclusus? The last line for Amber Spyglass, "And then what?" said her demon sleepily. "Build what?" "The Republic of Heaven," said Lyra. So both these novels have speech acts to end, and actually the structure here, "The Republic of Heaven," said Lyra, so that Lyra is both the very first word that we had in Northern Lights and the very last word that we will have in Amber Spyglass, the coming full circle. The Republic, Miltonic and Blakean, building a new Jerusalem in a green and pleasant land. Also perhaps res publica, the Botanic Garden, a place that is accessible, a place that feels like a public space, not a closed-off scholastic environment. Something that belongs both in Will's world and in Lyra's. Something that was free to enter when Philip Pullman was writing. It's not Eden, it's not Arcadia, it's not the earthly paradise from Dante's, but it is a Nostos, it is something like a paradise within happier far. And it's also the Physic Garden that was first built here in the 1620s into the 1630s, a place of medicine and of health, an aid to mankind. Physic that then became involved with natural sciences, with botany, a term that gets introduced at the Restoration, the gathering of plants and of science, and the science that deals with plants, their cultivation and their study. We've mentioned Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus, already. The advertisement for his 1791 poem, The Botanic Garden, makes very clear the scientific theory that's being produced for the development of the living world. About the poem, the general design of the following sheets is to enlist imagination under the banner of science, and to lead her votaries from the looser analogies which dress out the imagery of poetry to the stricter ones which form the ratiocination of philosophy. So the physics garden in Oxford became the Botanic Garden in the 1830s, when the future purpose of the site was defined as to experiment in the interest of science for the furthering of evolution studies. That was pretty good timing, because in 1860 it was hosting a party for the Darwinians, victorious in the great event of the evolution debate in the newly opened Natural Science Museum, a debate that took place in 1860 following the publication on the origin of species in 1859. Our contemporary Botanic Garden is a place to wander, to recharge the batteries, but it's also a teaching space and a working space, tasked specifically to further the study of human evolution. And possibly the success of Philip Pullman's works is going to give it a helping hand in that way, with a whole new generation discovering the Botanic Gardens through his novels. The natural growth is consciously managed, the intention being to provide the correct environment to grow and to study plants. So we're thinking about stewardship. We're back at Genesis, but we're pushing forward in a new fashion. We're thinking about growth patterns, about microclimates, about husbandry, about nutrition, about medicine. It's a place where you can have a scientific library, and it's a place where you can think consciously. In fact, I think it's one of the tools to be found in this trilogy of novels. 300 years ago, the Mulefa had said, that was how long the trees had been failing. Given that the shadow particles pass through all the worlds alike, presumably the same thing was happening in Mary Malone's world, which is ours, in her universe too, and in every other one. 300 years ago, the Royal Society was set up, the first true scientific society in her world. Newton was making his discoveries about optics and gravitation. 300 years ago, in Lyra's world, somebody invented the alethiometer. At the same time, in that strange world through which she had got here, the subtle knife was invented. Well, 300 years ago is also pretty much the dating for Paradise Lost. And although Philip can't have known this particular quotation when he was finishing his novels, because it's not published till 1999, there's a particularly strong Miltonist argument that was put forward by Karen Edwards in a book called Milton and the Natural World, which linked Milton's poem up with experimental philosophy, the phrase that Pullman uses so much for what we would call the natural sciences in our own world. Karen Edwards is talking in 1999 about the fact that Milton's poem is, quote, a poem which perfectly reflects its historical moment, the middle decades of the 17th century, when the mature development of Milton's experimental reading of the Bible coincided with the new experimental philosophy's opening of wide vistas on the natural world. It may well be that what's called Milton's attention to the compatibility of experimental philosophy and experimental devotion was the tendency of the former to articulate its project in terms of reading the book of the world. Certainly, in appropriating the traditional metaphor of the book of the world, the new philosophers refashioned it in ways that parallel Milton's refashioning of an experimental reading of the Bible. Both sorts of experimentalism validated and conditioned the experience of the individual. Each assigned unprecedented value to the individual's perspective, while stipulating that it submit itself to review and reassessment, that it acknowledge its provisionality and avoid equating itself with truth, and that it renounce claims to possessing absolute or overarching knowledge. So the Miltonists got there just about the same point in time by a parallel path, perhaps, to something that a very, very good reader of Milton had already discovered, that experimental philosophy is something that one can find encouraged in the taxonomy and the correct naming that's taking place in Paradise Lost. There are all sorts of very interesting artifacts and inventions in Pullman's trilogy, actually, that date from around this period of the later decades of the 17th century. And Milton, I think, is part of this argument. Milton saw man as a toolmaker as something which was double-edged. The ingenuity, the invention, the engines, they could go in more than one direction. But tools are definitely a way to facilitate a conversation with dust. But if you don't use them correctly, we can have this idea that the trees are failing. And the trees start to fail at the moment of the scientific revolution. The Anthropocene age begins. Our ability to corrupt and to poison the earth in real ways potentially begins there. That idea of the tools that you can use well and the tools that you have to learn to use better is possibly part of what's going on. We move through to the spyglass. 300 years ago, though, Thomas Sprat, in the History of the Royal Society, which again is 1667, puts on the frontispiece a refracting aerial telescope. He puts it there as one of the new tools, alongside manifold measurement tools and a gun. So there's a need to move beyond that particular colonization argument of discovery. And perhaps this might be one of the places that we should go. The arch where you can see both Charles I, he's the one showing a very nice ankle, and Charles II at the same time. The Botanic Garden as a tool which is organic, a seed catalogue, somewhere that we can go to have growth in the body. Both of these novels, to some extent, encouraging STEM subjects, Harding clearly moving girls in that direction. But Philip Pullman's evolutionary ethics have as much to do with word choice and the evolution of words, and how we find roots rather than fossils through thinking clearly about the words that we choose and the places that we use. So I wanted to take that little time to think about the Botanic Garden, but it's important also, I think, to think about its setting. The 5 acres down by the river outside the city walls in the east, but not Eden. Cherished today for its microclimate, but in times past the river mists made it less advantageous, low-lying and marshy. And it's the location till the 1290s of a burial ground for the Jewish community in this medieval city. And that is knowledge which most of those who live and work in this city stumble across at some point in time in their wanderings. It doesn't require book learning, it requires only curiosity. There's been a little plaque there since the 1930s. In 2012 it became a much more prominent plaque. But the path along the back of Merton College has always really been known as Dead Man's Walk, and you kind of always really did want to know why. It's the sort of thing that makes you wonder, and it's the sort of thing that takes you on a path to learn more. So this particular location is a location for growth, and it's also a location for rethinking about death and thinking about graves and about a new garden that doesn't just see restriction as something which is a necessary quality, but which uses the graves of the past and the memory of the past and the history of the past to take us to this pun, the Hadama pun, the pun which is Hebraic on Adam coming from the earth, to take us to a place which meditates on that, to allow us to think about past fidelities in the face of past restrictions and past discriminations, and what we might want to do with those today. It takes us to a place where intellect and husbandry and a sum of human experiences come together. It's a story of dust that has found a way back to a new take on a Judeo-Christian tradition. It was too good a word to waste, and it was a word that was picked up and renewed, and perhaps it's too strong an inheritance to deny. Certainly, Lyra rejected the big black book of scripture, and we watched her and read about her following the path to understanding dust. Now she's putting roots down in a garden, and it's a remarkably dusty setting, and she's considering her future projects, having rejected the book of scripture and replaced it with this intuitive and experimental response to the multi-verse book of nature, something about environmental ethics, something about thinking full circle. And here we are again with a new trilogy up and running. Lyra didn't get much to say in La Belle Sauvage, but Infants don't, do they? And if I'm confident of anything this evening, and I'm not confident of much, but if I'm confident of anything this evening, it's that from that book of scripture to that book of nature, I'm certainly not the only one in the room who's waiting with mounting anticipation for the book of dust and where it's going to take Lyra next. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Philip.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for sponsoring this lecture, and thank you most of all to Margaret for the wonderful generosity of your attention. I don't think anybody's read me quite as closely as you have. Well, maybe my copy editors have, because I'm going through that process at the moment with the second part of the Book of Dust. But their attention is on whether the word yellow here is really the right colour, or whether I deliberately used the word like twice in the same sentence, or all that sort of stuff, which isn't the kind of attention that is very interesting, really. Margaret's reading is a very interesting one, and I'm immensely flattered to find myself in the objective lens of her telescope, or if that's the right...
Subjective, definitely.
Subjective, I don't know. Anyway, thank you very much for that. The relationship between Milton and Blake is a very close one, of course. I think the best sentence of literary criticism in the whole of the English language is Blake on Milton. Blake, the reason Milton wrote in fetters when he wrote of angels and God, and at liberty when he wrote of devils and hell, is that he was a true poet and of the devil's party without knowing it. The important thing is, without knowing it, this is what Blake was saying. And of course, if you look at Milton, if you look at Paradise Lost with a certain kind of attention, you see that Milton is just as interested in putting as interested as he knows he should be in putting the case for God. But unfortunately for Milton, his God is an absolute stinker. The father and the son together are a pair of bullies. The father in particular, as soon as he sees what's happened in the Garden of Eden, said, see what's happened? Whose fault is it? Not mine, his fault. Like the playground bully who sort of tries to deflect the teacher's attention elsewhere onto somebody who's a little weaker. I don't think Milton intended to do this. I don't think Milton intended to make God an absolute brute, but he is. And I don't think he intended to make Satan such an attractive Heathcliff-like romantic hero, but undoubtedly he is. Milton tries at the end of Paradise Lost to try and make amends for this by turning all the devils at their conference in their pandemonium into a lot of hissing serpents. But that's just knockabout comedy. That's sort of medieval fairground stuff, which doesn't take away the mighty poetic achievement of creating the Satan of the earlier parts. One thing you didn't mention, Margaret, in that very interesting talk was Heinrich von Kleist's essay on the marionette theatre, which I've quoted many times as being a great influence on me when I wrote the book. Kleist was a German romantic writer and poet and playwright who, in about 1810, wrote the most extraordinary little essay called On the Marionette Theatre, which is all about this business of innocence and experience, in Blake's terms, of the transition from the playful, graceful ease of movement and being that we see in children to the awkward, stiff, uncomfortable, graceless way that we behave when we're grown-ups. I was very struck by this essay when I first read it in the mid-70s, when I was teaching children of that very age when that happens. And I saw the children come to the school I was teaching in at the age of 8 or 9 with all that freedom and all that grace, and they'd run about and they'd dance and they'd sing and they'd draw with enormous freedom and so on. And then little by little, as the changes began to come to their bodies and their minds, well, in Kleist's words, a steel net seemed to settle over the graceful play of their gestures. And I'd noticed this too. Kleist goes on in the essay to mention specifically chapter 3 of the book of Genesis, which he says is the foundation for most of what we know about the world. And he gives several examples, not only of children losing the childlike grace, but innocence occurring in things that have no consciousness, such as the puppets in the marionette theatre, which dance with absolute freedom, whereas the dancers at the opera house he's talking about are pretty bad at it. When I think it's when the dancer is when Paris is offering the apple, the golden apple. Look at him, he says. It's awful to see. His soul is present in his elbow at that point. He goes on to say, though, that from the innocence which equals unconsciousness of the puppet to the dim beginnings of consciousness in the bear, where she tells another little story, which I stole wholesale, to the full grace of the mature dancer who has learned through this loss of grace the way to recover it, which is a long and painful and arduous and unremitting struggle and strain and training, and eventually you come to the consciousness, Kleist says, of the God. So it is a process of evolution from unconsciousness to full consciousness, and that was what was lying behind a great deal of the story for me when I was writing it.
I think you talk a bit about it as well. I guess the way I translate it, but I think you use the term, I might not be right, wisdom. That idea of kind of moving through and kind of getting to a knowledge which is at ease with itself.
Yes.
Which is more than just knowledge, which is something which has gone beyond.
Yeah.
I mean, and that idea that because the last section, I guess, in Malefa Land, when Lyra and Will are kind of working out what happens next and what they might choose, that idea that they have to work hard. That's highly Miltonic, though, that idea that you've got to...
Yeah, very stern, very Puritan, very...
So that was definitely not Kleist. That's not particularly romantic, right? I mean, or maybe...
No, Kleist sees
the dancer, because it's embodied, and that's the difference.
Yeah.
And that's kind of also Blake, this embodiment of what's going on. But I guess I'm interested in that idea of coming through to full grace. I mean, that's certainly one trajectory that you can have when you kind of have these stories which are teleological, these stories which have to find conclusion in some way. I find it fascinating both for what that might mean for Lyra as she grows up, but actually also more particularly what it's meant for you, because in a sense, one of the things that's happened to you as a children's writer, as I understand it, is that you hit that period where the publishing machine has just been huge, and where your kind of your fans, like, you know, the people that come out on a Friday night for this kind of experience and are really excited, and thank you again, but really excited to have you here, also want a little bit of you to some extent, and I don't know how you keep your innocence or where you've done your training as a dancer.
Oh, that went a long time ago. Well,
because writing, I mean, because the more that you're conscious of what you're doing,
yeah,
the harder it's going to be.
Of course it is.
To get it right.
Yeah.
And I mean, you know, Belle Sauvage it's so tricky to come back, because you've come back and you've done the little quirky stories, and those have all been delightful and light. But this is the, you know, and the Kleist for me has been ringing in my thoughts with that, but actually kind of more for your own kind of experience of what it's like to have somebody say, look, that's good, because then you're like, gosh, how did I do that? You know?
Well, somebody says you shouldn't inhale praise too much. No, Blake is a great help again. I mean, Blake's polarities are innocence and experience. By experience, I suppose you could say wisdom, because wisdom cannot be innocent, and innocence cannot be wise. They are absolute polarities in that sense. I have found it very interesting to return to the universe of Lyra and to see what's happening to her. In La Belle Sauvage, she's, well, it's a sort of prequel. And the one I'm doing now is a sort of sequel, but as I said, this was my one gag. It's not a prequel and it's not a sequel, it's an equal. That's what I was saying. In the second book...
Did they tell you to spell it correctly?
No, it was an audible gag, so I didn't have to bother about the spelling. Yes, in the first book, Lyra is 6 months old, so she's not an agent in any sense. In the second book, which I'm just finishing now, well, it's finished, but I'm just tidying it up. She's 20 years old. She's an adult, and she's discovering some of the consequences of, well, what she did. Semi-consciously, I suppose we could say, without a full awareness of what it meant, in the Amber Spyglass.
Exciting.
Whether it works, well, I don't know.
I'm conscious that there may be people here who want to ask questions as well, so I'm going to open it up and ask if anyone has a question for Margaret or Philip or both. Who wants to start? No?
I can add something perhaps to what Margaret was mentioning just now. The effect of becoming visible as a writer. I published books for a long time. I published my first book when I was about 24, but I had been safely invisible because they didn't sell any of them, and so I was able to hide for quite some time. And when I was old enough to write Northern Lights, when I took it up at the age of, what was I, 93? No, I wasn't 93, it was in 1993. What was I then? I was in my 40s. And I was used to writing books that just disappeared. When this one didn't disappear, I was a bit surprised. And when the next one became even more visible and people started writing me saying, come on, hurry up and write the third one, well, I was very gratified, obviously. But I think I was sufficiently set in my ways then not to be thrown by it. I don't know how people manage if they have a huge success with their first book. I don't know how J.K. Rowling managed to cope, frankly, because it would probably have thrown me off course completely if I'd had a big success with the first book I published. But luckily, as I say, I'd had 20 years of being totally ignored and invisible to help me keep my balance when that happened. And actually now I don't think of the reader at all. In fact, I don't think I ever did think of the readers. I don't think of them when I'm writing the story. It's none of their damn business. Their function is to read it and rush out at once and buy the next one. That's the function of the reader for most of the time. But when the book is published, of course, the thing changes and they do have a voice. I believe one writer who was very insistent that there was a right way to read his books was William Golding. I'm relying on John Carey's biography for this. He'd say, you've got it wrong. It doesn't mean that at all. It means this. And we've seen another example of that sort of thing after the death of the wonderful Judith Kerr, who's the tiger who came to tea, is being interpreted in all kinds of ways. It's Nazism, it's puberty, it's all sorts of things. And she'd say gently, no, it isn't. It's just a tiger coming to tea. Well, that's rather my attitude. It's not for me to tell people what it means. It's for people like Margaret to tell people what my books mean. And I'm prepared to be interested in what they say and agree if I think it makes sense, and disagree if I don't, because I too have read the book and I have a view on it. But it's not a final view. The view of the author, in my opinion, is no more final about what, has no more authority than the readers do at that point.
What about the reader who changes their view?
Who would you mean? Who reads the book and thinks it's wonderful,
who
and then reads it again and thinks it's a load of rubbish?
Changes their view. So one of the things that's been interesting for me with this has been encountering these as new novels, very exciting, and then encountering a generation of students who managed to read them at the right age, quote unquote, you know, at 15 or whatever the right age might be, when the world is new.
Yeah.
And in a sense, that's one of the other parts of this interest for me, is that idea of kind of when the world is new, because the things that you read, and that's the first time you encounter that argument. That's just stimulating.
Yeah.
And then sometimes, of course, we want to kick against that argument slightly later. We go, oh my goodness, you know, that turns out to be Plato. He didn't say, and that may or may not matter. But for me, it's that a generation who read it then come to university. And there was certainly a moment when, you know, the lecture hall would fill, and it would have chemists in there, and it would have others in there, because they really wanted to come and hear something about your novels, because it hit them at the right moment and encouraged them to think.
Yeah.
Maybe the generation now, it's not the only book that they're reading at that age, but there certainly was that moment. And then, of course, the students who were on the course that I was teaching, which was English Language and Literature, read Milton, read Blake. They might even read Genesis, but, you know, we're not quite sure about that one. And then they come to a different understanding of the tradition, really, and of inheritance and of their place within it, all of which can be empowered by what you've given them, but they may well reread your book differently. I mean, there are books you reread differently.
Oh yes, well, it's always gratifying to me when somebody says, I read this as a child and then I read it again recently and I saw other things in it. That's a very gratifying thing. I think there's a question up there.
Thank you for the lecture and your comments. What is your opinion about my explanation for the story about Eden, that the only one command of God is, it was don't eat from the tree knowledge. And the meaning is, if you want to live in ideal situation, you should be stupid. And from this time, the human being try to find the ideal situation, and they won't return to Eden, to a stupid situation.
I'm not sure I heard every word of that. But as far as
I think it's ignorance is innocence.
Yes. Yes, the only command God gives is don't eat that tree. Yes, it's good. Don't eat the fruit of that tree. And one wonders why he put it there in the first place. Quite clearly, he did it to tempt them. If he didn't want them to eat it at all, he wouldn't have put it there. So therefore, in their eating of it, they're sort of fulfilling what he's surely set up. It's a kind of a trap, which again reinforces the idea that Milton's God is a devious, cunning, cruel, vindictive swine, because he sets them a trap which they're bound to fall into. On the other hand, we could interpret it in a Gnostic kind of way and say that, I mean, for the Gnostics, knowledge was the way to escape from the prison of this world, which they conceived of as a kind of hell of matter into which little sparks of divinity had accidentally fallen. And the way to get out of this world and back to the original beauty and glory of the light from which we came was knowledge. That was the way out. And God sets up the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and says, don't eat this. What he might be doing is setting up a temptation which is too strong for them, knowing that they will eat the knowledge of good and evil. They will plunge into all the misery which will follow their expulsion from Eden. But at the end of it, there is a redemption, in fact, and that's the Christian story, where we sometimes see the crucifixion depicted with a rising out of a skull, don't we? Which is the skull of Adam himself. So the two things are linked in that way. it's a story which is capable of an enormous number of interpretations, all of them true, but not all of them persuasive.
I find it interesting that we so much need there to be cause.
Yes.
You know, and that seems to me to be why we have to keep coming back to this movement, this storyline. Every generation, philosophy or creative writing, cause and effect.
Somebody said we can put up with any what as long as we have a why. And I think that's true.
I think, well, that one's closer, so I'll get that hand, and then there was a man in green just here. Who's next question?
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Which one are we having first?
Oh, well,
No,
it's that way. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
So, yeah. And then,
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Philip. That was really, really fascinating. I was just wondering on the line of being sort of aware of other things happening around you as a writer, especially with the new Book of Dust, whether you've been sort of very aware of the fact that the world has changed quite a bit since the publishing of his Dark Materials, and whether you've sort of deliberately started to feed that into the writing, or whether you're trying to sort of keep it separate from Lyra's world, and how much that will sort of, if you can tell us anything about how much that will feed into the Secret Commonwealth.
Well, I can't tell you much about the Secret Commonwealth because that would be, I want you to go and buy it. The world inevitably intrudes. The world inevitably makes itself part of what you're aware of because we're human beings and we're citizens and we're subject to the laws of time and change, just like everybody else. So you can't write in a complete bubble. You can't pretend nothing's going on around you. So inevitably it happens. And another thing that inevitably happens is that your morality will make itself clear in the book, whether you need it, whether you mean it to or not. As Blake saw in Milton. Milton's true values were those of valuing and praising the energy of Satan rather than the dead hand of God. Milton thought he was writing a book in praise of God, and it turned out he wasn't really. But we can't escape the world around us.
No, absolutely not. I mean, certainly not in your multiverse. I mean, that's your absolute point, is it? That you live where you are, and you live in that moment.
Yeah.
But I think it will be very interesting to see how readers respond, and I think to follow on from what I was saying before, I'm finding it really intriguing to find now that there are readers who've read La Belle Sauvage before Dark Materials, and I'm finding it very hard to get my head around that. I mean, that whole question of a sequel which is no longer a sequel.
Yeah.
And as you said, it's not a sequel. But the plot line and the development of a plot line and how a plot line's shifting and the wonderful range of opportunities that time gives you while you are developing that story. But yeah, because for me, there's now a chronology. But clearly, of course, that wouldn't be the first time, even in children's literature, that chronologies shift. You know, so we I don't want to even mention the other chapter, but we you know, the Narnia things where you read them in one particular order, and that's not the order that they were first written in, because he did the answers to the theology at the end, but we think of it as the first book and the last book.
I'm not too worried about, you know, whether it happened on Wednesday or Tuesday, or whether 6 weeks seem to have gone by, but I'm not too worried about that.
But for me, one of the things I thought was so exciting about your work was the environmental issues coming up so clearly for a readership in the 90s going into the year 2000.
Yeah.
And the things that you said about, you know, hugging trees and saving bears and ice, and in such an exciting and informed manner for younger people to get them engaged. And it wouldn't have, I mean, the respect would still be there, but it wouldn't be the same respect if you were writing that now, because it wouldn't have been so immediate. You're kind of ahead of the curve, yeah? And I think that's what's interesting me with the two books that I was talking about. A book that seems to me to kind of be one that has read Philip's work and wanting to do differently. But I'm interested in what will happen in that question of kind of what happens with your thinking that you've been developing and which actually is therefore distilled and should hopefully be sounder and not simply a sound bite against one particular moment. But I can't see you not talking about major themes. I just don't think you've got it in you not to talk about major themes.
Yeah, well, we can't help what we are. We can help what we do, but we can't help what we are. And
Libraries are important, aren't they?
Sorry?
Libraries are important.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And many other things beside, but that's not a political one. Well, it is a political one.
Yeah, yeah, of course it is, yeah. So there are various aspects of the contemporary world which do find their way into the secret commonwealth. I won't say what they are, but it's inevitable. You can't help that.
Yeah. Firstly, Margaret, thank you very much for your lecture. It's kind of fitting. I've just finished my finals, and you gave the lecture 3 years ago, roughly, that sort of encouraged me to study at Oxford in the first place. It was an informational lecture on an open day, so that's kind
you're going to make
of
me
lovely full
cry.
circle
And you
moment.
finished your finals.
Well done you. Great to see you here.
Thank you. Philip, going back to your comments on kind of the author sort of having no final say on how to interpret a work, I just sort of wanted to ask you about adaptations of his dark materials. The Hollywood adaptation from about 10 years ago was quite an interesting one because they stripped the theological significance away from the work to try and make it a bit less controversial. And now that it's being readapted again for television, I just wanted to kind of hear your thoughts about your level of how you feel about whether or not kind of levels of ownership over the ways your work is adapted for sort of various mediums.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting experience to be adapted. It's been adapted for the stage at the National Theatre and elsewhere. It's been adapted for a radio dramatisation. It's an audio book, which is the text with the help of actors doing the dialogue. It's now being a television, a long-form television thing. And each of them brings different problems to the work and has to find ways of solving them. The film was a victim of Hollywood. The film was a victim of the fact that Hollywood is intensely nervous of upsetting anyone and wants to make as much money as possible, so it produces bland things that no one can disagree with. If you want to make a film free of that kind of fear and anxiety and interference, you have to do what Woody Allen did for a number of years, which was to make a film that cost $1 million, and it made a profit. It made $1.25 million. So it wasn't shown very often, but it didn't lose any money, so he could go on and make another one, and nobody was upset by it because not very many people saw it. That's one way of doing it. The other way you could do is to hurl a lot of money at it, which the makers of the Golden Compass did, up-to-date CGI and all sorts of stars and things like that. But then you come into the realm of anxiety, because the producers who raise the money, above all, don't want to lose any. So they try and cover every angle and get everything done as fully and elaborately as they possibly can. One example of that is design. It was an over-designed film. Every little thing is covered with tendrils and twiddles and curly bits and baroque sort of extra. It was just over-designed because they didn't want to run the risk of leaving anything undone. I sometimes felt, in fact I still feel, that it would have been better to give the story to Postgate and Firmin, who made Noggin the Nog and Bagpuss, and let them do it. Because in their garage or shed or whatever it was, with little cardboard things on sticks, I think they'd have done a rather better job. However, the cast was very good in the Golden Compass. They were all good, and it was nice to watch them at work. I'm hoping that the television adaptation will have, because it has more time, we'll be able to tell the story more fully, but it's still an adaptation. It's not the original. But I was talking to a blacksmith once who made beautiful wrought iron gates and things, and he says he's constantly fed up because people buy his beautiful wrought and then paint them green or have a bit cut out for the cat to go or something. So he can't, you know, he hasn't any control over it. And it occurred to me that that's sort of what people do to the book, but they don't in a way, because the book is still there. There's no law that says the book has to be withdrawn and burnt just because a film is made of it. So, no, I don't mind. This is the one that's coming out now, and there might be another one in years to come, but the book is still there.
Well, thank you. I could go on listening to you all night, talk about adaptations of adaptations of adaptations and people's takes on different ideas, and it's been absolutely fascinating. I would feel dreadful if somebody had come to a lecture on a Friday night when his finals were just finished and it hadn't been as wonderful as this, but it was absolutely brilliant. So thank you very, very much, Margaret, and thank you, Philip, for your response. And thank you all very much for coming. There's another lecture next week. Next Friday at 5:30, it's Kate Clanchy, who's a very fine poet, and she teaches poetry to a very broad group of people at Oxford Spires Academy, and she's written a book called Some Kids I Taught and What They Taught Me.
Which is wonderful.
Which Philip, in fact, has said
Absolutely
Twitter, everyone must
book.
read. If you can't read it, come and see Kate talking about it. I know she's a wonderful teacher because I've been taught by her once. She's brilliant, and it'd be a really fun talk. But anyway, this was this year's John Milton Lecture. Thank you very, very much, Margaret and Philip, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.